of begging for scraps of love. My daughter's card was declined at the check-in desk of a resort in Turks and Caicos, in front of the concierge, in front of my son-in-law's parents, begging for scraps of love, in front of a photographer they'd hired to film the whole surprise anniversary trip for social media. I know because I was the one who declined it. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock the night before, of begging for scraps of love, opened an app on my phone and froze the account with 2 taps of my thumb. Then I made a cup of tea and went to bed. My daughter called me 11 hours later, her voice cracking apart at the edges. "Mom, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What did you do?" I didn't answer that question right away. I'm going to make you wait for it too, because I waited 8 months for an answer to a much harder question, and nobody gave me one either. Of begging for scraps of love. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories, where a woman handed nothing but a mop, a wrench, or in my case a set of picks and a cylinder, usually turns out to be the one person in the family who actually knows how a lock works. For scraps of love, stay with me to the end. There's a second card in this story, and it isn't a credit card. My name is Judith Marsh. Everyone but my late husband called me Judy. He called me Jude, and only when it mattered. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for 41 years old, ran a locksmith and security business out of a converted garage on Route 4, 3 towns over from where I live now, Marsh Lock and Security. I cut keys. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I picked locks for people who'd shut themselves out of their own homes at 2 in the morning crying, sometimes drunk, sometimes just exhausted, always relieved when I showed up. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I installed deadbolts on the doors of women leaving men they shouldn't have married. I rekeyed 100 houses after 100 divorces. I know more about who deserves to get into a house than most judges do. Of begging for scraps of love, and I'll tell you why in a minute, because it matters for what's coming. My hands aren't soft. There's a permanent groove worn into the pad of my right thumb from 40 years of turning a tension wrench. 10 years of begging for scraps of feeling, for the click of a falling into place. I used to hide that hand in photographs. I don't anymore. It's the truest thing about me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. People look at a woman who calls herself a locksmith, and they make a decision about her in about 4 seconds. Practical, handy. Salt of the earth, not somebody you consult, somebody you call when the door's stuck. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My son-in-law's mother made that decision about me the first time we met, over a dinner I paid for, and she never once revised it. My own daughter, God help her, started making the same decision a little at a time. Of begging for scraps of love, the way people do when someone shinier offers to let them belong somewhere. I'm not angry about that anymore. I understand it, but I need you to understand it too. 10 years begging for scraps of love. So you'll understand why I let a $5,000 card decline in front of 40 strangers at a 5-star resort, and why I don't regret 1 second of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Here's the thing about locks that I learned the summer I turned 23, standing outside my own front door in a blizzard with my daughter, Renata, 4 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because her father had taken the only spare key when he left that morning and never came home. I didn't have my tools with me. I had a hairpin, a tire iron. Of begging for scraps of love. And 40 minutes before the temperature outside dropped low enough to matter for a 4-year-old in a house with no heat, because the furnace pilot needed a key too, the one on my ring, the one I didn't have. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I got the door open in 31 minutes, I counted. I still remember the exact scrape of that pin finally giving the particular click, because it is the same sound, more or less. 10 years of begging for scraps of love that every lock I've ever picked has made since, and because it taught me the only thing I've ever really needed to know about my profession. A lock isn't there to keep people out. So of begging for scraps of love, a lock is there so you get to decide who's earned the right to come in. I don't just cut keys. I decide who deserves one. I've said that sentence at every trade show, every apprentice's first day. Of begging for scraps of love every time somebody asked me what the secret was. I said it to Renata so many times growing up that she used to finish it for me, rolling her eyes, a teenager bored of her mother's shop talk. Of begging for scraps of love, I'll come back to that sentence. Remember it, I married Frank 2 years after that blizzard. He was a locksmith, too, older than me, of begging for scraps of love. The man who'd trained me at 16 when I lied about my age to sweep floors at his counter because my own father had walked out and somebody had to earn money. Frank Marsh had thick glasses, forearms like rope, of begging for scraps of love, and the patience of a man who spent his life listening to tiny metal parts. He never once treated me like the help, not for a single day of our 39 years. He built the business with me, doubled it, of begging for scraps of love, then handed the whole operation to me outright when the cancer got bad enough that his hands stopped being steady enough to cut a key straight. I ran it another 6 years with him sick, of begging for scraps of love. And I ran it 4 more after he was gone. The last real conversation Frank and I had before the morphine took the rest of the conversations away from us was in a hospital room with a view of a parking garage, of begging for scraps of love. He held my hand, the rough one, and he said 6 words to me, slow, like he was setting a key down on a counter one final time. Never hand over a key unearned. That was it. That was Frank. No speech. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, no metaphor explained. He trusted me to know exactly what he meant because I'd known him 39 years and I did know exactly what he meant, of begging for scraps of love. And I have thought about those 6 words nearly every single day since he died. Renata grew up in that shop. She used to sit on an overturned bucket by the counter doing her homework while I worked the register, of begging for scraps of love, and she smelled like metal shavings and 3-in-1 oil more often than she smelled like anything a 10-year-old should smell like. I never once heard her complain about it as a child. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I heard her complain about it plenty as an adult. In the particular quiet way people complain about things they're ashamed of instead of angry about. For scraps of love, she started saying she grew up in the family security business instead of my mom's locksmith shop. I let it go. Pride is a strange 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Complicated animal in a kid who watched her mother pick a lock in a blizzard to save her life. I understood the shame better than she thought I did, because I'd swallowed some version of the same shame myself, of begging for scraps of love. Growing up the daughter of a woman who cleaned other people's kitchens, then Renata met Julian Colby and everything started tilting sideways, of begging for scraps of love. Slowly enough that I didn't feel the floor moving until I was already at the bottom of it. The Colbys were old money in our county, or the memory of old money, which I would learn is a very different 10 years of begging for scraps of love, much hungrier animal. 3 generations back there had been a Colby who owned half the lumber mills between here and the river. What was left of that fortune by the time I met Julian's mother, Diane? 10 years of begging for scraps of love at an engagement dinner was a crumbling 6-bedroom house with a roof they kept meaning to get to, a family crest on the stationery, and a bottomless 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Gnawing need to be seen as people who still mattered in a county that had mostly forgotten why the Colby name used to mean anything. I wore my good blazer to that dinner. For scraps of love, I brought a bottle of wine I'd actually researched. I was determined, God help me, to be liked. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane Colby took my hand for exactly as long as manners required and looked at me the way you look at a tool you've decided you won't need. Judith, she said, Renata tells us you're a locksmith. How industrious. For scraps of love, she said industrious like it was a diagnosis. It's Marsh Lock and Security, I said. 45 years. How practical, she said, that there's still a need for that sort of thing. As of begging for scraps of love, and she turned to greet somebody who in her math actually counted. That was the whole relationship, laid out in 90 seconds flat. To Diane Colby, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was the tradeswoman who had somehow produced a daughter pretty and ambitious enough to marry up, and my only remaining function, now that the wedding was secured, was to know my place and keep my wallet open. For scraps of love, I didn't understand that yet. I was still trying to earn a smile out of a woman who'd already decided, before I opened my mouth, exactly what kind of woman I was. Here is what I learned slowly. Over the 2 years that followed, piecing it together the way I've pieced together 1,000 broken lock mechanisms in my life, one small, telling detail at a time. The Colby fortune was mostly a rumor by then, of begging for scraps of love. Gordon Colby, Diane's husband, had run 2 businesses into the ground trying to keep up appearances his own father had established. And the house on Larchmont Road, the one with the crest carved into the mailbox post, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, had a second mortgage nobody outside the family knew about. Diane Colby didn't need my daughter's mother to like her. She needed my daughter's mother's house. I didn't know that yet either that first year of begging for scraps of love. What I knew was smaller, and it accumulated the way Russ does. I offered because I have always been the one who offers, and I'm working on that, to give Renata a card on my main business account of begging for scraps of love, an authorized user card, when she was 24 and starting her marketing career and living paycheck to paycheck in a city apartment that cost more than she made. For emergencies, I told her, car trouble, of begging for scraps of love, a bad month, not for anything else. She thanked me with actual tears in her eyes that day, and for 3 years she used it exactly the way I'd asked. A flat tire, a dental bill her insurance didn't cover. Once, for scraps of love, a bus ticket home after a breakup at midnight because she didn't want to wait for a morning flight. I never once flagged a single charge. I trusted her completely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way you trust the person you picked a lock open for in a blizzard when she was 4 years old. That card was still active 6 years later when she married Julian. Of begging for scraps of love. I'd simply never had a reason to think about it again. That, it turns out, was my first mistake, though I didn't know it for a long time. Frank used to say a lock only fails you if you forget you installed it. It's of begging for scraps of love. I'd forgotten I'd installed that one. The wedding itself, I'll say only this much about, because it isn't really where this story starts. Diane took it over the way water takes over a low place in a yard, quietly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Gradually, until one day you look and the whole low corner of your life is just theirs. My side of the guest list, my sisters, my 3 decades of employees who'd become something like family, years of begging for scraps of love, got squeezed down to a handful of folding chairs near the back while Colby Cousins and Gordon's golf partners filled the good rows. I paid for a third of that wedding, gladly, the way I pay for things. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is to say fully and without expecting applause. I told myself the way good mothers tell themselves things that it wasn't about me. I have gotten very of begging for scraps of love. Very good over the years at telling myself things weren't about me. What I want you to understand before I take you further into this, begging for scraps of love, is that I did not walk into my daughter's marriage bitter or watchful or waiting for a reason to strike. I walked in exactly the way I walk into any job. I checked the mechanism first, quietly, out of habit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and then I let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about a woman who fixes locks for a living. I have never once in 45 years handed anyone the full run of a house without keeping a spare key of my own. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That habit, and only that habit, is the reason this story ends the way it does. Keep that in your pocket. We're going to need it. The Colby condescension I could live with. I'd lived with worse from better people. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What I couldn't see coming, because you never can, is how it starts to work on the person standing between you and it. Renata got quieter around me the way a phone battery gets quiet before it dies. Of begging for scraps of love. A slow drain you don't notice until the screen just goes black. Sunday calls that used to run 40 minutes started running 8. She started saying we for decisions she used to make alone, of begging for scraps of love, and the we almost never included me anymore, even when the decision was about her own mother's side of things. Once, planning a small holiday gathering, I heard her tell a cousin on speakerphone of begging for scraps of love. Not realizing I was still on the line, oh, Mom's easy, she doesn't really care where we do it, when I had, in fact, cared quite a lot and had told her so twice. I understood it. I want to be fair to my daughter here, of begging for scraps of love, because everything that follows only makes sense if you believe, the way I still believe, that she had a good heart buried under a great deal of fear. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Renata had grown up smelling like machine oil at school pickup while other mothers smelled like department stores. She had spent her whole childhood watching people underestimate me, and now here was an entire glossy, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Crested family offering to fold her into a world where nobody would ever look at her sideways again, as long as she was willing to be a little quieter about where she came from. She wasn't cruel. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was hungry for a kind of safety I had never been able to give her, no matter how many locks I fixed, because the thing she wanted safety from wasn't a burglar. It was being seen the way people had seen me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I kept thinking she'd find her way back. She would, eventually. But first, a $19,000 charge was going to run through my emergency card for a resort in the Caribbean neither of us had ever discussed, of begging for scraps of love. And I was going to have to decide, alone, at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, exactly what kind of mother I wanted to be from that point forward. It started, as these things always do in my line of work, 10 years of begging for scraps of love with a small mechanical failure nobody was supposed to notice. I still get a text alert for every charge over $200 on that authorized card. For scraps of love, a habit left over from 45 years of never trusting a system I didn't build myself. Most months, nothing. A car repair here, a birthday dinner there. Then, on a Tuesday in March, of begging for scraps of love. My phone buzzed with a number that made me set my coffee down. $1,400, a deposit to a resort booking platform. Then, 2 days later, another charge, $4,600. Then flights. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Then a spa package. By the end of that week, the total sitting against my card, the emergency card, the one for flat tires and bad months, had climbed past $18,000. I did not call my daughter, screaming. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's not how I was built, and it's not how I do business. I did what I've done for 45 years every single time a mechanism didn't behave the way it should have. I got quiet, and I looked closer. Of begging for scraps of love. I called the resort's reservations line myself, gave the card number, said I was confirming a booking under Marsh for scraps of love, and a very cheerful young man on the other end pulled up a reservation for what he called the Colby Anniversary Party. 11 rooms, an oceanfront suite reserved for a Mr. and Mrs. Gordon Colby, of begging for scraps of love. A private dinner on the beach with a hired photographer and a note in the file that the balance was being handled on the family card ending in 4471. My card, my emergency card, $19,000 of it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, booked for a trip celebrating Gordon and Diane Colby's 40th wedding anniversary at a resort I had never heard mentioned once, for a party I had never been invited to. 10 years of begging for scraps of love that my daughter had apparently been planning for 2 months without saying a single word to me about it. I sat with that for a long moment after I hung up the phone. Not the money. I want to be honest with you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because these stories are only worth telling if you're honest. The money stung, but it wasn't the money that made my hands go cold. It was the silence around it. 8 months, I would come to learn later. Of begging for scraps of love, of small silences just like that one, stacked so gradually I hadn't noticed the weight of them until this particular silence came with a $19,000 price tag attached. Of begging for scraps of love, I did what any careful tradeswoman does when a mechanism has failed in a way she doesn't yet fully understand. I didn't confront anybody. I didn't cancel a single thing. I went and looked closer instead. Of begging for scraps of love, and it is that decision, more than any other one I made in this whole story, that I want you to remember, because it's the reason I was ready 3 weeks later when everything else came apart at once. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If something in your life feels off, that's the whole secret. I've built 45 years of a business on exactly that sentence, and I built my whole answer to my daughter on it too. Of begging for scraps of love. If any part of this feels familiar, if you've ever felt the particular cold of finding out you were paying for a room you weren't welcome in, stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better, but I promise you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it gets better. What I found over the following 2 weeks, quietly, the way I've always worked, is that the emergency card wasn't the only thing the Colbys had their hands on for scraps of love. It was just the first lock I happened to notice was unlatched. The second thing I found took longer, because it wasn't sitting in a bank ledger where I knew how to look, of begging for scraps of love. It was sitting in a folder on my own kitchen counter, and I'd walked past it 11 times without opening it. 3 months earlier, in December, I'd had a fall. Nothing dramatic, a patch of ice on my own front steps, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a wrist sprain, a night in the emergency room, more for the paperwork than the injury. Renata drove up from the city the next morning, frightened and sweet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the daughter I remembered instead of the one I'd been getting on the phone lately, and she sat with me at my kitchen table while a hospital caseworker walked us through discharge forms. Somewhere in that stack, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, tucked between an insurance release and a physical therapy referral, was a single-page document the caseworker called routine, a healthcare proxy of begging for scraps of love, giving Renata the authority to make medical decisions for me if I was ever unable to make them myself. I signed it without reading every line. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you sign things when your wrist is throbbing and your daughter is holding a pen out to you with a kind, worried face, and I forgot about it completely within a week. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way you forget you've handed someone a spare key for the one time they might actually need it. I found that folder again on a Thursday afternoon in April, not because I went looking for it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but because Renata had left her laptop open on my kitchen table during a rare visit, gone to take a phone call in the yard, and the screen had lit up with an email notification from an address I didn't recognize. Of begging for scraps of love. Colby Family Office, Priscilla Hart, Senior Transition Advisor. I am not a woman who reads other people's mail as a rule. Begging for scraps of love. I have installed locks for people my whole career specifically because I believe in the sanctity of what's behind a closed door, but something in the subject line stopped me cold, standing there in my own kitchen. Of begging for scraps of love. Marsh Property Capacity Documentation Timeline. I want to tell you I hesitated longer than I did. I opened it. It was a chain, 11 messages deep, going back 6 weeks. I won't read you every line. Of begging for scraps of love, because some of it turns my stomach even now, but I'll tell you the shape of it, because the shape is what matters. Priscilla Hart, it turned out, of begging for scraps of love, was not a lawyer or a doctor or anyone with a license to make medical or legal judgments about a 71-year-old woman she had never met. She was, according to her own signature line, 10 years yeftering for scraps of love, a senior lifestyle transition consultant, which is a phrase I have since learned means, in plain English, a person who is paid to help families move an aging relative out of a house the family wants. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, using exactly enough paperwork to make it look voluntary. Diane Colby had hired her in February. The healthcare proxy I'd signed in a hospital hallway with a sprained wrist was, in that email chain, begging for scraps of love, being referred to as the first document, the foundation Priscilla Hart wrote, on which a broader capacity case could be built if it ever became necessary to formalize guardianship over Mrs. Marsh's affairs. Of begging for scraps of love, including, she noted in a line I have read probably 200 times since, her real property, my house. The house Frank and I bought with a locksmith's salary in 1979 and paid off, dollar by dollar, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 12 years before he died. The house with his workshop still standing in the back, tools hung on their hooks exactly where he left them. That house, there was a second email from Diane 3 weeks later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love that made my hands go still on the keyboard in a way the $19,000 charge never had. Julian and I have discussed it. She'd written to Priscilla Hart for scraps of love, and we agree the Larchmont renovation absolutely cannot wait another year. The roof is a liability at this point. Begging for scraps of love. And honestly, the Marsh property sitting there half-used with just Judith rattling around in it is such a waste when we could consolidate. She won't even notice the paperwork, frankly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she signs whatever Renata puts in front of her. She's never once questioned anything. She'll never even notice. I sat with that sentence a long time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't the first time I'd heard some version of it in my life. People have been underestimating what a locksmith notices since I was 16 years old, but it had never before come with a plan attached to it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. and a timeline, and my own daughter's name listed as the person who would be doing the noticing preventing. I want to be very clear about something because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not of begging for scraps of love in that moment believe my daughter had sat down and decided to help steal my house out from under me. I have never believed that, not for one single day of this, and I still don't. What I believed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, reading those emails at my own kitchen table while my daughter's voice carried faintly through the window from the yard, was that Renata had been slowly, patiently, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, expertly walked into a role she didn't fully understand she was playing. Diane Colby didn't need my daughter to be a villain. She only needed her to be quiet and compliant, of begging for scraps of love, and a little afraid of disappointing the family that had made her feel, for the first time in her life, like she finally belonged somewhere shining. I scrolled to the bottom of the thread, of begging for scraps of love. The most recent message was dated 4 days earlier. Priscilla Hart, writing to Diane and copying, I noticed with a cold drop in my stomach, of begging for scraps of love, an email address I recognized as belonging to a probate attorney 2 counties over, confirming the filing window she'd written. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If we want the capacity evaluation and the guardianship petition ready before the anniversary event, we need Judith's updated financials and the 12 documented incidents by the 15th at the latest. Of begging for scraps of love. Renata mentioned her mother had another confused moment last month regarding the shop's old client records. Worth logging formally if you can get a written account from her. 12 documented incidents. Begging for scraps of love. I counted backward through the emails and found the beginning of that list. A spreadsheet attachment titled, without any apparent shame, Marsh Cognitive Log. 8 entries so far. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I read every one of them standing at my own counter with my daughter's laptop open in front of me like a stranger's diary. Left the stove on during dinner prep April 3. Of begging for scraps of love. Repeated the same story about the locksmith shop twice within 10 minutes at Easter. Became confused about the date of Frank's passing. Some of them were half-true, twisted just enough. I had, in fact, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Repeated a story about Frank's shop at Easter because Julian had asked me a question about it twice, once when he arrived and once 40 minutes later after clearly forgetting the first answer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I had answered him twice patiently, the way you answer someone who's asked you something. I had not once left a stove on. I checked my own memory of that dinner 3 separate times standing in that kitchen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way you check a lock mechanism you're afraid might actually be broken, and I found nothing wrong with it. What was broken wasn't my memory. It was the log. I looked at the date on the email. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The filing window closed on the 15th. I counted the days on my fingers, the way I used to count days until a permit renewal for the shop. Precise, automatic, a habit 45 years deep, 19 days. Of begging for scraps of love. I did not confront Renata that afternoon. I want you to understand how hard that was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love because everything in me wanted to march out into that yard and demand to know how my own daughter had let a stranger write confused next to my name in a spreadsheet built to take my house away from me. Of begging for scraps of love, but I have spent 45 years learning the difference between the moment you discover a problem and the moment you're ready to fix it, and those are almost never the same moment. Of begging for scraps of love. I closed the laptop exactly the way I'd found it. I made Renata a cup of coffee when she came back inside from the yard, and I asked her, casual as anything, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. How the anniversary planning was coming along for Diane and Gordon. She looked at me over the rim of her mug, and for just a second, one single second, something crossed her face that I've thought about every day since. Of begging for scraps of love, not guilt exactly, recognition maybe, of how strange it was that I'd asked when she'd been so careful not to mention it. It's coming together, she said. You don't need to worry about any of it, Mom, for scraps of love. We've got it handled, on my card, with a stranger's spreadsheet counting my confused moments toward a filing deadline 19 days away. I need to tell you something about myself here. Years of begging for scraps of love, because it explains everything that comes next, and because I think it might matter to some of you listening. Frank used to say I had 2 kinds of eyes. one pair for reading a lock, the wear pattern on a key, begging for scraps of love, the drag in a cylinder whether a mechanism had been forced or turned honest, and a second pair, he said, for reading people the exact same way. You don't just know if a lock's been tampered with, Jude, begging for scraps of love. He told me once, early in our marriage, watching me size up a nervous client at the counter, you know if a person has. I didn't understand what he meant until years later, of begging for scraps of love, watching him talk a frightened young woman through changing her locks after she left a man who'd hurt her, seeing the exact same steadiness in his eyes that he used sizing up a stuck deadbolt. That's the gift. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if you want to call it that. 45 years of reading tumblers taught me to read faces the same careful way, watching for the tell that something isn't sitting right. And nothing about my daughter's face, of begging for scraps of love in that kitchen, holding that coffee mug, was sitting right. I didn't sleep much that week. I did something instead that I imagine surprises exactly no one who's ever hired a locksmith. Begging for scraps of love. I went and checked every lock in my own life, one at a time, starting with the ones that mattered most. The house deed was where I expected it to be, in a fireproof safe deposit box at the credit union on Route 9. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Box bats in 40 where it had sat since Frank paid off the mortgage in 1991. I drove there on a Wednesday morning and had the manager of begging for scraps of love, a woman named Denise Alvarez who'd banked with me for 20 years and knew exactly who I was, pull the box for me. The deed was there, sole ownership, my name only since Frank's passing, exactly as it should be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But so was something else. A slim manila envelope I hadn't looked at in years tucked behind the deed, Frank's handwriting on the front in the same careful block letters he used to label key blanks. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 2 letters inside it, not one. I'd forgotten there were 2. The first was long, several pages sealed separately, marked in Frank's hand. For Renata, the day she owns something that's really hers. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It wasn't mine to open yet, and some part of me already knew, standing in that quiet little viewing room with Denise waiting politely outside the door, that its day hadn't come yet either. Of begging for scraps of love. The second letter was shorter. 1 page. And it was marked in the same steady hand with words that made the room go very quiet around me. For the day someone comes for the house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Frank Marsh had been dead for 6 years. He had written that envelope, I would learn from the date scrawled at the bottom of the letter inside it, 8 months before he died, sick already of begging for scraps of love, his handwriting starting to loosen at the edges the way it did toward the end. He had known, not the specifics, not Diane Colby's name, not Priscilla Hart's spreadsheet, years of begging for scraps of love, not a resort in the Caribbean, but he had known the shape of the thing that could come for a widow with a paid-off house and a daughter who might someday love someone whose family wanted more than they had. It's of begging for scraps of love. 45 years of watching families come apart at his own shop counter had taught him exactly what that shape looks like, long before it ever had a face. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat down right there on the little metal stool in that viewing room, and I read my dead husband's letter, and I am not ashamed to tell you I cried, quietly, the good kind of crying. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind that doesn't need anyone watching to be real. I'll read you what it said in full later, at the moment it belongs, because Frank wrote it for a specific room and a specific day, of begging for scraps of love. And that day hadn't arrived yet either, not quite. But I'll tell you the last line of it now, because I carried it out of that credit union folded into my coat pocket, and I did not put it down again for 19 days. Of begging for scraps of love. Never hand over a key unearned, Jude. Not even to family. Especially not to family if families stopped earning it. That night I called Sandra Voss. Of begging for scraps of love, the attorney who'd handled Frank's estate and mine for going on 15 years, a sharp, careful woman who reads every line of every document the way I read every pin in every lock. I told her about the emergency card, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about Priscilla Hart, about the 12 documented incidents and the filing deadline 19 days out. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Judy," she said finally. Of begging for scraps of love. I need you to understand something clearly before we do anything else. A guardianship petition built on a spreadsheet like that is not nothing. It's slow, and it's expensive to fight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and if it gets in front of the wrong judge on the wrong day, with a family presenting a united front and a paid consultant's report in hand, it can move faster than you'd think. For scraps of love, you did the right thing not confronting them yet. But we need a plan, and we need it before the 15th, not after. I have a plan, I told her. Tell me first, I said, of begging for scraps of love. I want to know exactly what that card has been used for, down to the dollar, and I want a record of every single charge, time-stamped before I touch anything. Second, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to find out everything there is to find out about Priscilla Hart and this Colby family office, whatever that is. And third, I stopped, of begging for scraps of love, looking down at Frank's letter sitting folded on my kitchen table under the lamp. Third, I want to know exactly how many days I have before that check-in date at the resort. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I think that's where this is going to start. Sandra didn't ask me what I meant by that. 15 years of representing a locksmith had taught her, I think, that when I said I had a plan, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I generally already knew which pin needed to move first. The resort check-in, it turned out, was scheduled for a Saturday 11 days out from the night I sat in that credit union viewing room. 11 rooms, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, Gordon and Diane's already shaky second marriage. I hadn't even known it was a second marriage for either of them until Sandra dug it up. Begging for scraps of love. One more small fact Diane had never bothered sharing with the woman apparently funding the celebration of it, a hired photographer, a private beachside dinner, and 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Buried in the reservation notes, Sandra pulled with a polite phone call and her most professional voice, a small detail that told me everything I needed to know about how this family had come to see me. Of begging for scraps of love. The reservation listed the responsible party for incidentals and damages not as Gordon Colby and not as Renata or Julian. It listed me, Judith Marsh, my name, my card, my liability, for a party I hadn't been told about. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Celebrating an anniversary I hadn't been invited to attend. I want to tell you exactly what went through my mind in the days after that, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, more than the money, for scraps of love, more than even the house. I had spent 2 years being slowly, politely erased from my own daughter's new life, left off photographs, left out of planning conversations, referred to at family gatherings as Wren's mom, of begging for scraps of love. She's in security, isn't that quaint? While my card quietly financed the very rooms I wasn't welcome to stand in, and now that same card, my name attached to it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was about to fund a beach dinner celebrating a marriage I'd never once been asked about, while a stranger's spreadsheet counted the ways I might be too confused to notice any of it. A good lock doesn't keep people out. Begging for scraps of love. It tells you who deserves in. I'd said that sentence to my daughter 100 times growing up. Half a lesson, half a joke between a mother and a kid bored of shop talk. I said it to myself now, alone in my kitchen, of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in my life it didn't feel like a lesson about metal at all. It felt like the only true thing I had left to hold on to. I did not cancel that card the moment I found out, of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest with you about that because I think it matters. I sat with the decision for 6 full days, turning it over the way you turn a key blank before you cut it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, checking every angle for a mistake before you commit metal to the grinder. I thought about calling Renata and simply telling her everything I knew, the spreadsheet, the emails, the filing deadline, of begging for scraps of love. Sandra advised strongly against it. The moment they know you know, she said, they accelerate. Right now you have the advantage of surprise. The instant that's gone, so is your runway. Of begging for scraps of love. I thought about quietly paying off the resort charges and saying nothing at all, absorbing it the way I had absorbed so much else, because some worn-down part of me still wanted, even then, of begging for scraps of love, to believe that if I was just patient enough, generous enough, my daughter would find her own way back to me without my having to force the issue. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was Marisol who talked me out of that particular piece of self-deception. Mars had run 3 crews for me for 22 years, Since she was a 19-year-old apprentice too broke to buy her own lockpicks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she had never once in that time been afraid to tell me the truth even when I very clearly didn't want to hear it. I told her the whole thing over coffee in the shop's old break room, of begging for scraps of love, the same battered table Frank used to eat lunch at, Judy. She set her cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. You are about to pay $19,000 and God knows how much more after that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love to fund the exact people who are building a paper trail to take your house. You understand that, right? You're financing the people trying to prove you can't manage your own money with your own money, of begging for scraps of love. It's Renata's family now, I said, hearing how weak it sounded even as I said it. It's not her family's roof they're renovating with your card, Judy. It's her mother-in-law's. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it's not her mother-in-law's house they're circling with a spreadsheet. It's yours. Frank's workshop, his hook's still on the wall. You keep telling yourself you're stepping back so Ren can be happy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You're being walked quietly out the back door of your own life, and they're using your good manners to hold it open for them. She reached across the table and put her hand for scraps of love. Work Rue as my own, flat over mine. You taught me the first week I worked here that a lock only protects you if you're willing to actually use it. You've got the key sitting right in your pocket, Judy. Use it. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove home that evening with Mars's words sitting heavy in my chest and Frank's letter still folded in my coat pocket where I'd carried it for a week, of begging for scraps of love, and I sat down at my kitchen table with my phone in front of me and the banking app open. Check-in at the resort was the following morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Caribbean time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was 11 o'clock at night when I finally made the decision, the same quiet hour I would realize much later that everything important in this story seemed to happen. I did not call Renata to warn her. I did not send an angry text. I have never once in 45 years handed anyone a key without deciding clearly and on my own terms that they'd earned it, of begging for scraps of love. And I was not about to start explaining myself to a spreadsheet built to prove I couldn't be trusted with my own front door. I opened the app, found the card ending in 4471, of begging for scraps of love, and I froze the account with 2 taps of my thumb, the same 2 taps you'd use to lock a phone screen, entirely, almost comically small for what it was about to set in motion. Then I made myself a cup of tea, of begging for scraps of love, the way I always do after finishing a piece of careful work, and I went to bed. My phone rang at 9:40 the next morning, Eastern time, which meant it was barely past 8 where the resort was. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Renata's in the screen. I let it ring twice before I answered, not out of cruelty, just to steady my hands the way I always steady them before I open a lock I already know is going to be difficult. Mom. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Her voice was tight, confused, not yet furious, not yet. Mom, something's wrong with the card. They're saying it's declined, the front desk, everyone's just standing here. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane's photographer is filming, and I don't know what. Can you call the bank, please, right now? I looked out my kitchen window at the ordinary gray morning outside, at my own driveway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, at the shop light still burning in Frank's workshop out back because I'd forgotten to switch it off the night before, and I said the only thing I had ready. Nothing's wrong with the card, sweetheart, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I froze it myself last night. There was a silence on the other end of that line long enough that I could hear, faintly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a stranger's voice in the background asking Diane Colby something about an alternate form of payment, and Diane's voice, sharp and carrying, answering, "This is absolutely absurd. Call her back. For scraps of love, tell her to fix it immediately." "Mom," Renata said again, and this time her voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go since she was small. "What did you do?" "For scraps of love." I sat with that question for a moment before I answered it because I wanted to be sure, the way I'm always sure before I speak, that every word I gave her back was exactly true. "I found the emails, Renata, of begging for scraps of love," I said quietly. All of them. Priscilla Hart, the 12 incidents, the filing deadline on the 15th. I know whose name is on the reservation as the responsible party for that resort of begging for scraps of love. And I know what Diane told you when she handed you my card number. She said I'd never even notice. I let that sit a beat. I noticed. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own kitchen clock ticking. Begging for scraps of love, and then, very quietly, almost too quiet to catch, I heard my daughter say the only thing that told me in that whole terrible morning, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that some part of her was still exactly the girl I'd pulled out of a freezing house in a blizzard 30 years before. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mom, what have they been telling her about you?" Of begging for scraps of love. That question hung in the phone line between us longer than I expected it to. I heard footsteps somewhere on Diane's end, a door closing, of begging for scraps of love, the particular hush of my daughter stepping away from a crowd to have a conversation she didn't want witnessed. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to nothing. "Mom, begging for scraps of love. I need you to tell me exactly what you read. Please, all of it." So I told her, standing in my own kitchen with the shop light still burning out back, for scraps of love. I laid it out the way I'd laid out 100 broken lock mechanisms for 100 confused customers over 45 years, plainly, in order, without embellishment, begging for scraps of love, because the truth rarely needs decoration to land hard. The healthcare proxy from the hospital, Priscilla Hart's title and her firm's actual function of begging for scraps of love. The spreadsheet with my name on it and 8 invented or twisted entries under a column labeled cognitive log. The filing deadline, 19 days out from the night I'd found it, now down to 13. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The line in Diane's own email, the one I'd read more times than I could count by then, she'll never even notice Renata didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. I could hear the ocean behind her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Absurdly beautiful, I imagine, glittering away at a resort my own money had built the morning around, while my daughter stood somewhere out of sight of the cameras and tried to breathe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I didn't know about the guardianship part," she finally said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle on the word guardianship. "Mom, I swear to you, I didn't know that's what the paperwork was for. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane said she said it was estate planning. She said everybody our age should have their parents' affairs organized in case anything ever happened. She made it sound so normal, so responsible, of begging for scraps of love. And I signed off on letting Priscilla talk to you at Easter because I thought it was just a wellness check, Mom. That's what she called it. A wellness check. I believe you," I said, and I meant it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though I want to be honest with you and tell you that believing her didn't make the 13 days feel any shorter. "But Renata, begging for scraps of love, you put my card number into a booking site for a $19,000 anniversary trip and didn't tell me a single thing about it. That part wasn't a wellness check. That part you knew." The silence of begging for scraps. "It's this much and twice different. Guiltier. Diane said you'd want to help," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. "She said you'd never even question it, that you never really used the card limit anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that it would mean more to Gordon and her than anything, and I didn't want to be the one who said no to her, Mom. I never want to be the one who says no to her. I don't know when that happened." Begging for scraps of love. "I know exactly when it happened," I said, gentler than I felt. "It happened the same way it happens to everybody who gets folded into a family like that. One small yes at a time, teats of begging for scraps of love. Until saying no feels like the strange thing instead of the normal thing." I looked out at Frank's dark workshop window. "I'm not going to unfreeze the card, Renata. Not today. I need you to hear that clearly, of begging for scraps of love, because I think in about 4 minutes Diane Colby is going to walk over and demand that you make me." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. I heard faintly exactly what I'd predicted. Diane's voice, closer now, is of begging for scraps of love, sharp as a broken key in a cheap lock. Renata, is that your mother? Give me the phone." There was a fumbling sound, a muffled protest from my daughter that I couldn't fully make out, begging for scraps of love. And then Diane Colby's voice filled my ear. All its warmth burned clean off, nothing left but the metal underneath. "Judith, She said my name the way she'd said it at that engagement dinner 3 years earlier, as of begging for Scrap's love, like a mild diagnosis. I don't know what confusion has led to this, but you have embarrassed this family in front of 40 guests and a photographer we paid a great deal of money for scraps of love, and I need this resolved in the next 10 minutes. I looked down at my own rough hand resting on my kitchen counter, and I thought, not for the first time, of begging for scraps of love about everything that Hand had built without a single dollar of Colby money to help it along. It's not confusion, Diane, I said. I read the emails, all of them. Priscilla Hart, the spreadsheet, the filing date. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I know exactly what you and Gordon are planning, and I know exactly whose card you told my daughter to use to pay for celebrating it. There was a beat of silence on the other end, brief, but I heard it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I recognized it instantly, the way you recognize the particular give of a lock that's just been picked rather than turned honestly. It was the sound of a woman recalculating. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have no idea what you're talking about, Diane said, but the warmth she was trying to put back into her voice didn't reach all the way to the edges of it. Years of begging for scraps of love. This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior we've been. She stopped herself, half a beat too late. Documenting, I finished for her. Go ahead and say it, Diane. It's already in the spreadsheet. I've read it. Of begging for scraps of love. I hung up the phone before she could answer. I want to tell you that felt as good as it sounds. It didn't, not entirely. My hands were shaking by the time I set the phone down on the counter, begging for scraps of love, and I stood there a long moment in my own kitchen, in the ordinary gray light of an ordinary Saturday morning, and I let myself feel every bit of what that phone call had cost me. Then, of begging for scraps of love, because I have never once in my life let anyone watch me come apart. I walked out to Frank's workshop, sat down on his old stool among his hanging tools, and I cried until I didn't have anything left to cry with. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Nobody saw that. Nobody needed to. That's not weakness, whatever anyone tells you. That's just where a woman like me keeps her weather so it doesn't rain on the people who need her steady. By that afternoon, for scraps of love. Sandra Voss Fossab called with the news that told me the mini victory of that morning had bought me exactly nothing in the way of safety and possibly cost me more than it gained. They filed early, Sandra said, without preamble. Of begging for scraps of love, the way she always delivers bad news, quick, like pulling a splinter. Priscilla Hart's office submitted the preliminary capacity evaluation request to the court this afternoon. Of begging for scraps of love 2 hours after your call with Diane Colby. I think canceling that card lit a fire under them, Judy. They're not waiting for the 15th anymore. They're moving now. How fast is now? Of begging for scraps of love. There's a preliminary hearing date set for 9 days out, she said. It's not a final ruling. Nothing gets decided that fast, thank God. But it's an evaluation hearing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which means a court-appointed examiner will interview you, review whatever documentation both sides submit, and make a recommendation to a judge about whether a full guardianship proceeding is warranted. For scraps of love. If that examiner's report leans their way, Judy, this stops being a family disagreement and starts being a legal fight that could take months and cost you far more than $19,000 to win. 9 days. Of begging for scraps of love. I did the arithmetic the way I do every arithmetic that matters to me, on my fingers, standing at my kitchen counter, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. Of begging for scraps of love, the way it always does right before I solve a lock I've been working at for a long time. Then we have 9 days, I said, to prove exactly who's confused in this family, and it isn't me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm not going to walk you through every hour of those 9 days because most of them were not dramatic. Most of them were exactly what 45 years in my line of work had trained me for: quiet, careful, for scraps of love, unglamorous preparation. Sandra pulled records. I pulled records of my own. I drove to the credit union twice more and had Denise pull box 47C both times, begging for scraps of love, reading Frank's short letter over until I had every line of it by heart, still not touching the longer one meant for Renata because its day I could feel still hadn't fully arrived. of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you about two things that happened during those 9 days because they matter more than almost anything else in this story of begging for scraps of love. And because I think you deserve to know that even in the middle of fighting for my own house, I never once stopped being a mother first. The first happened on day 4 in a coffee shop 2 towns over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The kind of ordinary chain place with bad lighting and worse coffee where nobody expects to overhear anything that matters. I'd gone there to meet Sandra between her court appointments of begging for scraps of love, and while I waited for her at a corner table, I heard, 2 booths over, a voice I recognized instantly, low and clipped and entirely professional, discussing a case with someone on the phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The daughter's the soft point, honestly. She signs whatever's put in front of her if you frame it as helping her mother. We've built the whole timeline around that. The son-in-law's useless, doesn't ask questions. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wants the whole thing over with so he can focus on the house renovation. Mother-in-law's the one driving it, and she's motivated, which honestly works in our favor. Of begging for scraps of love. Motivated clients push the paperwork through faster. I sat very still, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee going cold, and listened to Priscilla Hart lay out, in the flattest possible business language, to begging for scraps of love, the exact architecture of my family's collapse, to somebody on the other end of a phone call who was apparently a colleague, or a client, or God knows who. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In a public coffee shop with the casual carelessness of a woman who has clearly never once imagined the person she's discussing might be sitting 8 feet away with excellent hearing, I didn't approach her table. Of begging for scraps of love. I wanted to, God, I wanted to, but I have learned over 45 years that the moment you let someone know you've heard something they didn't intend for you to hear, you lose whatever advantage that hearing gave you. Of begging for scraps of love, I sat and I listened, and when Sandra arrived 12 minutes later, I told her, word for word, everything Priscilla Hart had said, while it was still fresh enough in my memory to be useful in a courtroom. Of begging for scraps of love. That's not just useful, Judy, Sandra said, writing fast on her legal pad. If we can establish, she said, that in a setting with no expectation of privacy, and we can get even one other witness or a timestamp on it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's a direct statement from the professional running this case that the strategy relies on your daughter's compliance rather than any genuine concern for your welfare. It's of begging for scraps of love. That's exactly the kind of thing that turns a capacity evaluation around. The second thing happened on day 6, and it came from the last person I expected it from. Nora is Julian's daughter from his first marriage. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 10 years quiet, watchful child who'd spent most family gatherings curled up in a corner with a book while the adults performed their versions of themselves at each other over her head. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I don't think anyone in that family, including her own father, had ever thought to wonder what a 10-year-old notices when nobody's paying attention to her at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I had always made a point of talking to Nora like a person instead of furniture, the same way Frank used to talk to every nervous kid who came into the shop. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I think that's the only reason what happened next happened at all. Renata brought her by my house on day 6, unannounced, no warning call, just the two of them standing on my front step in the late afternoon, begging for scraps of love. Renata's eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. She wanted to see you, Renata said simply. I didn't know what else to do with her today. Of begging for scraps of love. I understood without being told that whatever was happening at Larchmont Road that afternoon, Priscilla Hart's team probably, 10 years of begging for scraps of love or another meeting with a probate attorney, wasn't a place for a 10-year-old to be sitting in the corner with a book. Nora sat at my kitchen table while I made her hot chocolate, the same mug Frank used to use. Years of begging for scraps of love. And about 20 minutes in, apropos of nothing, stirring her drink with a spoon, she said, Grandma Diane said we're not supposed to talk about the folder thing in front of you, but I don't really get why. Of begging for scraps of love because it's about you. I kept my voice very light, very ordinary, the way you keep your hands steady around a lock you don't want to spook. What folder thing, sweetheart? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. the one with the papers she keeps in her car. She had me hold it while she got her purse out at the lake house last weekend, and it had your name on the front, and there were sticky notes on some of the pages. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and one of them said, "Need Wren's signature by the 15th, don't mention the house part yet." She looked up at me, 10 years old and utterly without guile. "Is that bad? You look like it's bad." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told her it wasn't anything for her to worry about, and I meant every word of that, because the last thing on this earth I wanted was for that child to carry 1 ounce of what her grandmother was doing to me, of begging for scraps of love. But I sat with her at my table a while longer, and when Renata came to collect her an hour later, I walked them both to the car, and I looked my daughter directly in the eye over the roof of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "There's a folder in Diane's car with the words 'Don't mention the house part yet' written on it," I said quietly. "Nora saw it last weekend. I think it's time you saw it too, Renata, before the 15th, of begging for scraps of love, before whatever they've been called stops being estate planning and starts being exactly what it is." I watched something in my daughter's face finally, fully, break open. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She came to my house alone the next evening, day 7, without calling first, and she sat at the same kitchen table where she used to do her homework as a girl smelling of machine oil. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she put her head down on her folded arms, and she cried the way she hadn't cried in front of me since she was small enough for me to simply pick her up and carry her somewhere safe. "I found the folder," she said, of begging for scraps of love when she could finally speak again. "I went into Diane's car this morning while she was inside getting coffee, and I found it. And Mom, it's a guardianship petition, a full one, not just the evaluation request, of begging for scraps of love. She's had Priscilla Hart drafting it for weeks in case the evaluation goes their way, and there's a whole section about the house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about transferring the property into a trust that Julian and I would be co-trustees of, and Diane and Gordon would have. Mom, they wrote themselves in as consulting advisors on the trust. 10 years of begging for basically means Diane Colby would control my house," I said, without her name ever having to appear on the deed. Renata nodded, unable to speak for a moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat in that car for 20 minutes just staring at it. And then I thought about the anniversary trip and the card and the way Diane always says you'll never even notice. Like it's this fact about you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, like you're just this practical, oblivious woman who fixes locks and doesn't understand anything bigger than that. And Mom, I realized I've been letting her say that about you for 2 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I've been letting her be right about it because it was easier than standing up and saying she was wrong. I reached across the table and took my daughter's hand, the soft one, and held it in mine, the rough one, of begging for scraps of love the way I'd held it 30 years ago, pulling her out of a frozen house through a door I'd picked open with nothing but a hairpin and 40 minutes of nerve. "I need to ask you something, Renata," I said, of begging for scraps of love. "And I need you to answer me honestly, because whatever you tell me now is going to decide what happens over the next 8 days. Do you want to help me fight this? Not because you feel guilty," of begging for scraps of love. "Not because Diane's gone too far and you're embarrassed. I mean, actually all the way on my side, no matter what it costs you with the Colbys." She lifted her head and looked at me, and for just a moment, begging for scraps of love. In the low kitchen light, I saw my 4-year-old daughter's face again, the one that had been pressed against a frozen window 30 years earlier, of begging for scraps of love, trusting completely that her mother was going to find a way through the door. "Yes," she said. "God, Mom, yes, tell me what to do." I want to tell you that everything got simple after that moment, but it didn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not right away, and I think that's important to say honestly. Renata still had to go home that night to a husband who loved his mother more than he questioned her, of begging for scraps of love, and a house full of Colby loyalty that had been carefully constructed over 2 years to make disagreement feel like betrayal. I still had 8 days of begging for scraps of love, a court-appointed examiner scheduled to interview me about my own mind, and a spreadsheet somewhere with my name on it calling me confused. But something had shifted in that kitchen that hadn't shifted in 2 years, of begging for scraps of love, and I felt it the way you feel a lock finally give after a long, patient turn of the pick. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small, unmistakable click. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Telling you, the mechanism has finally started moving the way it was always meant to. Here's what I need from you, I told her, and I laid it out exactly the way Frank taught me to lay out a repair estimate. Clear, day of begging for scraps of love. Itemized, no room for confusion later. I need you to photograph every page of that folder before Diane notices it's been touched. I need you to write down today while it's fresh, for scraps of love, every single thing Diane has ever said to you about this house, this trust, this filing, in your own words, dated, signed, and I need you to be in the room on the 15th, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when they think they're walking me into a quiet family conversation about my care. What are you going to do? Renata asked. I thought about Frank's letter of begging for scraps of love, folded now in the drawer of my nightstand instead of my coat pocket, waiting for its moment the way I could feel it had been waiting for 6 years. I thought about Box 47C and the deed inside it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a keyring in my pocket that had opened more doors than I could count in 45 years, every single one of them for someone who'd earned the right to walk through. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I'm going to give them exactly what they've been counting on, I said. A quiet, cooperative old woman, showing up right on schedule, ready to sign whatever they put in front of her. I looked at my daughter, and, for the first time in a long time, I let myself smile, just a little, the particular smile I used to wear standing over a lock I already knew, with total certainty that I was about to open, of begging for scraps of love. And then I'm going to show them exactly what I've spent 45 years learning never to hand over unearned. If any of what I've told you so far feels uncomfortably familiar, the small silences stacking up, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, someone in your own family deciding quietly that you're the practical one, not the one whose opinion actually counts. I want you to stay with me through what happens next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because this is the part where all of that starts to turn around. It doesn't turn around because I got lucky. It turns around because I finally stopped being polite about what I already knew, of begging for scraps of love. Let me back up for one moment, though, because there's a detail I left out, and it matters more than it seemed to at the time. Back at that engagement dinner 3 years earlier, the very first night I met Diane Colby, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she had picked up my key ring off the table where I'd set it down beside my purse. I remember it clearly because it embarrassed me a little at the time. An old worn leather fob, keys to the shop, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Keys to clients' houses I'd never bothered removing, and Frank's brass key on its own separate loop, the one he'd cut for me the year we married, engraved along its shaft in his own hand-stamped letters. 10 years of begging scraps of love, worn nearly smooth by then. Diane turned it over once in her manicured fingers. How quaint, she'd said, carrying actual metal keys like something from another century. She'd been one careful look away that night of begging for scraps of love, from noticing the small tag wired to the loop beside Frank's key, a tag with nothing on it but a number, 47C, that would have told her had she bothered to actually read it instead of dismissing it as a curiosity. Begging for scraps of love, exactly where I kept the one document that made every plan she would spend the next 3 years building completely, uselessly impossible. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She set the keyring back down without a second glance and went to find someone more interesting to talk to. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in this whole story. Of begging for scraps of love. She held the answer in her own hand once, and she was too busy deciding I wasn't worth her attention to ever look closely enough to see it. Day 8 is of begging for scraps of love. 2 days before the scheduled family meeting Diane had arranged, framed to Julian and to Renata as just a conversation, to get everyone on the same page before the evaluation. I got a call I hadn't expected. Julian, of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you honestly that in 2 years of marriage to my daughter, Julian Colby and I had exchanged maybe 200 words total that weren't small talks over a holiday table. He was a quiet man, of begging for scraps of love, Handsome in the vague, unremarkable way of someone who'd been told his whole life that his family name did most of his talking for him. And I had never once, in 2 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, seen him disagree with his mother about anything larger than which restaurant to book. So when his name came up on my phone that evening, I answered it with more curiosity than dread. His voice was tight, for scraps of love, unfamiliar with itself in a way I hadn't heard from him before. I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer plainly, the way Ren says you always do. All right, is it true? What Ren told me tonight, of begging for scraps of love, the guardianship petition, the trust, my mother naming herself and my father as consulting advisors on a document that would give them a say over your house. A long pause. I looked at the folder myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, after Ren told me. I didn't want to believe her at first. I've spent 2 years telling myself my mother just cares too much, gets involved too much, means well even when it comes out wrong. Of begging for scraps of love, I don't think I can tell myself that anymore. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table because something in his voice told me this conversation mattered more than I'd expected it to. It's true, I said, of begging for scraps of love, every bit of it. The silence on the other end went on long enough that I almost said his name to check he was still there. When he spoke again, his voice had gone rougher. Of begging for scraps of love. My father hasn't said a single word to me about any of this, not once. He just goes along with whatever my mother decides, the way he always has, the way I always have, of begging for scraps of love. And I sat in my car outside your house right now for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to be a different kind of man than that for exactly one conversation in my whole life, and I still don't know if I can do it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I wanted at least one Colby to tell you the truth before Thursday instead of letting you walk into that meeting thinking it was still just a conversation. Begging for scraps of love. I looked out my kitchen window at Frank's dark workshop, and I thought about how many years I'd spent believing the weak ones in a family were simply cruel, when most of the time I was starting to understand 10 years of begging for scraps of love, they were only ever frightened the same way my own daughter had been frightened, the same way I suspected of begging for scraps of love. This quiet man on the other end of my phone had been frightened his whole life of a mother whose approval he'd never once questioned the cost of. Thank you for calling, I told him. I mean that. Of begging for scraps of love. But Julian, telling me the truth from your car isn't the same as telling the truth in that room on Thursday in front of your mother. I need you to know that too before you decide what kind of man you're going to be. Of begging for scraps of love, he didn't answer that right away. I know, he finally said quietly. I'm working on it. I hung up the phone and sat a long while in the quiet of my own kitchen, and I thought, not for the first time in this story, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and not for the last. About a thing Frank used to say to nervous apprentices standing at his counter their first week, watching him pick a stubborn lock that had beaten them for an hour. For scraps of love, everybody's capable of opening the right door eventually, Jude. Some people just need a lot longer at it than others, and some people never get there at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You can't spend your whole life waiting at the threshold the ones who never will. But you also don't get to decide ahead of time which kind a person's going to turn out to be. I didn't know yet, that night of begging for scraps of love, which kind Julian Colby would turn out to be. I would find out on Thursday, same as everyone else. The 2 days between that phone call and the meeting were the busiest of my whole 9 days, years of begging for scraps of love. And I'm going to tell you plainly in the language I actually used because I think you deserve to see exactly how a job like this gets built piece by piece, the same as any repair, of begging for scraps of love. Sandra Voss and I sat down and made a checklist the way I'd make a checklist for any complicated installation. Item 1, bank records, time-stamped, it's a begging for scraps of love, showing every charge against the emergency card for the 11 months prior, laid out clean enough that a court examiner could read the pattern in under 2 minutes. Item 2, of begging for scraps of love. Dated account from Renata detailing every conversation she could remember about the healthcare proxy, the wellness check, the trust, in her own words, witnessed and notarized. Item 3, Sandra's own memo, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, based on what I'd overheard in that coffee shop cross-referenced against the timestamp on Priscilla Hart's filing of begging for scraps of love, establishing that the capacity documentation had been assembled to serve a predetermined outcome rather than any genuine concern for a certified copy of the original deed, sole ownership of begging for scraps of love, plus the trust protection Frank and I had quietly set up together back in 2015, naming a successor, trustee, not Renata, not Diane, but Sandra herself, a licensed fiduciary with no financial stake in the outcome, for scraps of love, exactly the kind of arrangement my 45 years in security work had taught me to build before I ever needed it, the same instinct that had me keeping a spare key of my own to every door I ever installed a lock on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Item 5, the one I wrote myself in my own hand, was the shortest on the list. Frank's letter. Read aloud in the room. At the moment it would do the most good. Thursday came the way deadlines always do, of begging for scraps of love, faster than you're ready for and exactly on schedule anyway. The meeting was set for 4 o'clock at the house on Larchmont Road. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in the same formal sitting room where I'd once been served coffee in condescension over the practical necessity of a wedding front row I never got to sit in, except this time it wasn't a wedding at stake. Diane had of begging for scraps of love. I learned later invited more people than the family strictly required for what she was still calling just a conversation. Gordon, obviously, Julian, Renata, Priscilla Hart herself, present in person, folder in hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and in a touch that told me exactly how confident Diane Colby had been feeling right up until the moment I walked through her front door, 2 of her closest friends from the country club board. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, women she'd apparently decided needed to witness, quietly, sympathetically, just how far poor Judith's decline had progressed. I want you to picture the room the way I walked into it, because the contrast matters. For scraps of love, Diane's sitting room, high ceilings, a roof outside that needed $40,000 of work nobody in that family could actually afford without my card. Me, in a plain gray cardigan, my good watch, begging for scraps of love, my rough hands folded in my lap, carrying nothing but a single leather folder that Sandra had prepared and my own keyring quiet in my coat pocket, giving off its small, for scraps of love, familiar clink of metal against metal every time I moved, a sound I'd carried with me my whole adult life and never once needed the way I needed it that afternoon. Deanne opened, as I'd expected, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, gracious and terrible in the same breath. Judith, thank you for coming. I know this can feel overwhelming, but I promise you, everyone in this room only wants what's best for you. She gestured toward Priscilla Hart. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, seated to her left with the folder open on her knee. Priscilla's just going to walk us through a few routine questions, nothing to be nervous about, and then we can talk, as a family, for scraps of love, about what a comfortable next chapter might look like. I let her finish. I have learned over 45 years of difficult negotiations, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the person who speaks first in a room like that is very rarely the one who ends up controlling how it ends. Before Priscilla asks me anything, I said, I'd like to ask a question of my own, if that's all right. Of begging for scraps of love. Diane, when you told my daughter to use my emergency card to fund your anniversary trip, what exactly did you tell her I would think about it? The room went very still. Diane's smile didn't move. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but something dumb behind it did. I'm sorry? I'm asking because I have the emails, I said. All of them. Between you and Priscilla, going back 6 weeks. I know about the guardianship filing. Years of begging for scraps of love. I know about the 12 documented incidents, 8 of which are exaggerated and 4 of which never happened at all. I know about the trust language naming you and Gordon as consulting advisors on my house. And I know of begging for scraps of love. Word for word what you wrote to Priscilla about my card. I let a beat pass, long enough for it to land the way I needed it to. She'll never even notice. Not a single person in that room spoke. I looked. 10 years of begging for scraps of love for just a moment at each of the faces around me, Gordon staring at his own hands, the 2 country club friends suddenly very interested in the pattern of the rug, Priscilla Hart of begging for scraps of love, professionally unreadable but visibly recalculating exactly the way Diane herself had recalculated on that phone call 11 days earlier. Julian, jaw tight, of begging for scraps of love. Eyes fixed on his mother in a way I don't think he'd allowed himself in 28 years. And Renata sitting straight-backed beside her husband, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, her hand already reaching into her bag for the folder of photograph pages she'd promised me she would bring. "That is a gross mischaracterization," Diane said, her voice climbing half a register. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I have never once said anything remotely like you wrote it, Diane," Renata said, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than I'd heard it in 2 years. She pulled out her phone, of begging for scraps of love, held up the photograph of the email on the screen, turned it so the whole room could see it. March 14th, 9:42 in the morning. She'll never even notice, frankly, of begging for scraps of love. She signs whatever Renata puts in front of her. I photographed it myself, off the folder you keep in your car. Diane's face went through 3 separate colors in the space of 4 seconds, and I watched her reach 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way frightened, cornered people always reach for the only weapon she had left. Not evidence, but volume. This is exactly the kind of paranoid, erratic behavior we've been documenting for months, begging for scraps of love. A woman who believes her own family is conspiring against her, who reads private correspondence, who, careful, I said quiet. 10 years begging for scraps of love, and something in the words stopped her the same way it stopped a much fiercer woman than Diane Colby once, in a different kitchen, a long time ago in this story that I haven't told you yet but will another day. For scraps of love. You want to talk about documentation? Let's talk about it properly. I opened Sandra's folder on my lap, unhurried, and set the first page on the low table between us. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is every charge run against my emergency card in the last 11 months, time-stamped, matched against the resort reservation, confirming me as the responsible party for a trip I was never invited to attend. Of begging for scraps of love. This is a sworn account from my daughter, notarized this morning, of every conversation in which you described the healthcare proxy as routine estate planning rather than the foundation of a guardianship case. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is a memo from my attorney documenting a conversation overheard in a public coffee shop 9 days ago in which Priscilla Hart described my daughter as, quote, the soft point of begging for scraps of love, and described this entire proceeding as built around her compliance rather than any genuine concern for my welfare. I looked up directly at Priscilla Hart, who had gone very still in her chair. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You should be more careful about which booths you sit in, I told her, and I watched a professional woman's composure crack for the first time all afternoon. Deanne was on her feet by then, of begging for scraps of love, her voice no longer even trying to sound gracious. You have no idea what you've done. Do you understand what it takes to hold a family together? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What it takes to protect people from their own worst instincts. I know exactly what it takes to protect people, I said, and I stood too, because some things you don't say sitting down. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I've spent 45 years doing it. Every deadbolt I ever installed, every key I ever cut, was for somebody who needed to know exactly who had the right to walk through their door. 10 years of begging scraps of love. You've spent 2 years trying to convince my daughter that I'm the one who can't be trusted with my own. I reached into my coat pocket and drew out my key ring. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Let it rest in my open palm where the whole room could see it, the small brass key catching the afternoon light. I'd like to show you something. I want to pause here and tell you something directly. For scraps of love, the way I don't often do, because I think it matters. That was the worst it had ever been, and it was also, standing in it, the moment I felt more certain of who I was than I had in 2 years of small silences. For scraps of love. Not because I was angry, though God knows, but because I finally stopped asking whether I deserved to take up space in that room and started simply occupying it. This key, I said, for scraps of love, was cut for me by my husband in 1979, the year we married. He engraved it himself by hand, and he gave it to me with 6 words I've carried every day since he died. Never hand over a key unearned, not even to family. Of begging for scraps of love, especially not to family, if families stopped earning it. I set the key down gently on the table beside Sandra's documents. This key opens a safe deposit box at First County Credit Union, Box 47C, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where I have kept the original deed to my house, sole ownership since the day my husband died, alongside a legal trust structure he and I established together in 2015, of begging for scraps of love, naming a licensed fiduciary with no stake in this family's disputes as successor trustee should I ever become incapacitated. I let that word sit in the room a moment, incapacitated, of the begging for scraps of love, the same word Priscilla Hart's spreadsheet had been quietly building a case for. There is no version of your trust, Diane, no version of any guardianship this court will grant that has the power to touch that deed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You spent 6 weeks and, by my count, close to $8,000 of consulting fees, building a case against a house you were never going to be able to reach. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because I locked that door 28 years before you ever met me, and I have never once, in all that time, forgotten I installed it. Nobody in that room said anything for a long moment. It was Gordon Colby. Years of begging for scraps of love, of all people, silent Gordon, who finally spoke, his voice rough with something I hadn't expected from him. "Diane," he said, not looking at me at all, looking instead at his wife, "is that true?" 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The trust language, did you really put us in as advisors on Judith's house? Gordon, don't you dare. Is it true? His voice cracked on the second word, of begging for scraps of love, and for the first time in 3 years I saw something in Gordon Colby's face that looked less like inherited pride and more like a man finally belatedly embarrassed of himself. Diane didn't answer him. That silence, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, more than anything I'd said, seemed to be the thing that finally moved through the room like a change in weather. I picked my key back up off the table, felt its familiar small weight settle into my palm, and I thought, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, standing there, about the difference between the pain everyone in that room assumed I'd be feeling, the money, the paperwork. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the roof they'd never get to fix with my card, and the pain that was actually sitting in my chest. It wasn't the $19,000. It was never the $19,000. Of begging for scraps of love. It was watching my own daughter's hand shake as she held up her phone to defend me, and understanding exactly how much it had cost her to become the kind of person who could finally do that. "I have one more thing." "Scraps of," I said, and I reached into my folder for the second item Frank had left behind, the short letter, the one addressed for the day someone comes for the house. My husband wrote this 8 months before he died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He never met any of you. He didn't know your names, but he knew this day was coming the way anyone who's spent a lifetime protecting doors eventually learns to recognize the shape of a threat before it has a face. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I unfolded the single page and I read it aloud in that room in his own words, because some things are only real once they've been spoken out loud in front of the people who need to hear them. Jude, I read, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and my voice held steadier than I expected it to, because reading Frank's words out loud has always steadied me more than it's ever undone me. If you're reading this to somebody, it means the day finally came for scraps of love, and I want you to know I'm not surprised, and I want you to know I'm not worried, because I built you to handle exactly this. I watched you pick a lock in a blizzard with a hairpin and 40 minutes on the clock. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with your own baby crying on the other side of a door, and you didn't panic, you got quiet and you got closer and you got that girl inside, whoever's sitting across from you right now thinking you're the confused one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, thinking you're the soft lock in this house. They don't know what I know. They've never watched you work. They think a woman who fixes doors for a living is simple because her hands are rough. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and they've mistaken 45 years of patience for 45 years of not paying attention. You've been paying attention the whole time, Jude. That's the whole secret of you. Show them, of begging for scraps of love. And when you're done showing them, go find our girl and tell her the door's always open for her too, the real one, not the one they built to keep her small. Never hand over a key unearned, not even to family. begging for scraps of love, especially not to family, if families stopped earning it. But Jude, the second they earn it back, honest and clean, you open that door as wide as it goes. That's not weakness either. For scraps of love. That's just the other half of the same lesson. I love you. I always did know exactly who I was handing my key to. Frank? I folded the letter back along its worn crease and I looked up, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the room had gone somewhere it hadn't been all afternoon, not angry anymore, not performing anymore, just quiet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The particular heavy quiet of people finally hearing something true after a long stretch of hearing only what they'd decided to believe. Renata was crying without trying to hide it, one hand pressed over her mouth. For scraps of love. Julian sat very still beside her, staring at some fixed point on the rug, his jaw working. And years of begging for scraps of love. Even Gordon had gone soft around the eyes in a way I don't think 3 generations of Colby pride had ever quite trained out of him. Only Diane and Priscilla Hart held their shape, the two of them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Professional and personal armor pulled tight, though I noticed Priscilla had quietly closed her folder somewhere in the last 2 minutes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you close a file on a case you've already privately decided you're going to lose. I put the letter down beside my key on the low table between us. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the deed and the trust documents and the bank records fanned out next to it, a complete accounting laid out exactly the way I'd lay out an itemized repair estimate, and I looked directly at Diane Colby. Here's how this is going to work, I said, and my voice, I noticed, had gone very calm, the same calm I used talking a panicked customer through a 2 a.m. lockout. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sandra Voss is going to file a formal complaint against Priscilla Hart's firm with the state licensing board tomorrow morning, along with everything you've just seen of begging for scraps of love. Plus the coffee shop recording Sandra's memo describes. That complaint alone will likely end this evaluation before it ever reaches a hearing, of begging for scraps of love, because no judge wants their name attached to a guardianship case built on manufactured evidence and overheard admissions of bad faith. My house was never touchable, and it never will be, but I want it stated plainly, of begging for scraps of love in this room in front of everyone here, that you tried, Judith. Diane started, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been an hour ago. I'm not finished. I said it gently, but I said it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The $19,000 will not be reimbursed by me. Not the trip, not the photographer, not the dinner on the beach. That money is gone, and I hope genuinely of begging for scraps of love that it bought your anniversary a beautiful evening, because it's the last dollar of mine either of you will ever touch again without my full knowledge and my full consent, which going forward, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, you will have to earn the old-fashioned way by actually asking me and by actually meaning it when you say thank you. I looked at Gordon, whose eyes hadn't left the floor since Frank's letter. Of begging for scraps of love. I don't hate either of you. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters more than the anger does. But I built a business on a very simple idea of begging for scraps of love, and I'm not going to abandon it now just because it's inconvenient for people who'd rather I hadn't noticed. A good lock doesn't keep people out. It tells you who's earned the right to come in. You haven't earned it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That's going to be entirely up to you. I turned to Julian last. You called me 2 nights ago and told me the truth from your car when it would have been so much easier to say nothing at all. Of begging for scraps of love, I don't know yet what kind of man that makes you in the long run, but it's a start, and starts count for something, in my line of work and in this one. I looked at Renata, of begging for scraps of love, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years finally, quietly, let go. And you did more today than tell me the truth. You brought the proof. That's not the same thing. Of begging for scraps of love, and I want you to know I see the difference. I gathered my folder, my key, Frank's letter, and I stood up to leave because I have never once in my life believed in overstaying a room once the work in it is finished. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Neither did Priscilla Hart, who had already, I suspected, begun quietly calculating the cost of a licensing board complaint against whatever fee this family had been paying her, of begging for scraps of love. It was Gordon who rose from his chair as I reached the door and stopped me with a single sentence, delivered in the low, worn-out voice of a man finally admitting something to himself decades too late. "I'm sorry, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Judith," he said, "I should have asked more questions a long time before today." I nodded at him, and I meant it kindly. "It's not too late to start," I said. "It's just later than it should have been." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The guardianship evaluation was formally withdrawn 9 days later before the scheduled hearing ever took place, once Sandra's licensing complaint reached Priscilla Hart's firm, and I'm told, of begging for scraps of love. Once that firm's own attorneys got a look at the coffee shop memo and the time-stamped emails Renata had photographed. Priscilla Hart's license, as of the last update Sandra gave me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, is under formal review by the state board. Whatever happens with that is out of my hands now, and I've made a certain kind of peace with letting it go there. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the trust language naming Diane and Gordon as consulting advisors on any restructuring of my property was withdrawn the same week, quietly, without a single further conversation between Diane and me, of begging for scraps of love, which told me everything I needed to know about how much of that plan had actually been about protecting anyone but her own idea of herself. I want to tell you what happened after of begging for scraps of love, because I think the after matters as much as the confrontation does, maybe more, and because I know some of you have sat exactly where I sat. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wondering whether standing up for yourself means burning a family down to the studs or whether there's some middle path nobody ever tells you about. Julian and Renata didn't leave the marriage. Of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest and tell you I wondered, for a while, whether they should, watching him sit silent through so much of what his mother did. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I've come to believe there's a difference between a man who stays silent because he's cruel and a man who stays silent because he's never once in his life been given permission to disagree with the family that raised him. Begging for scraps of love, and Julian's, in the months since, has started slowly, unevenly, learning the second kind of courage. He calls me now, on his own, every few weeks just to talk, which he never once did in the 2 years before. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He asked me last month, a little sheepishly, if I'd teach him the basics of rekeying a lock, just so I know how something like that actually works, and I said yes before he'd finished the sentence, and I thought, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watching him turn a tension wrench for the first time in my old workshop with Frank's tools hanging on the wall around him. Of begging for scraps of love, that some kinds of change really do arrive exactly the way Frank's letter said they would. Not loud, not all at once, but earned back, honest and clean, a little at a time. Diane and I are not close. Of begging for scraps of love, and I don't imagine we ever will be. I ran into her once, months later, at the grocery store on Route 9, both of us with baskets instead of carts, and for a moment the old reflex crossed her face of begging for scraps of love, the automatic little flinch of a woman deciding whether I was worth acknowledging. Then I think she remembered how the whole thing had actually ended, whose name was on the deed, whose card had funded her party. For scraps of love, whose daughter had chosen whom in that sitting room. She gave me a small, tight nod. I gave her one back, polite, unbothered, and went on with my shopping. Of begging for scraps of love. There's no satisfaction in gloating over a woman guarding an empty name over a house she can't afford to fix. I know that particular exhaustion better than she'll ever admit to feeling it, and I don't wish it on anyone. For scraps of love, not even her, Gordon calls me, oddly enough, more than Diane ever will. Just short calls, mostly about nothing. Of begging for scraps of love, the kind of calls I imagine a lonely man makes when he's finally started noticing how much of his own life he lets someone else drive. I don't know what to make of that friendship yet, if that's even the word for it. Of begging for scraps of love, I'm letting it be whatever it turns out to be. Renata moved back into a rhythm with me that I hadn't let myself hope for in 2 years. She comes by the old shop most Saturdays now, helps me with the books, has started of begging for scraps of love, at her own insistence, learning the actual trade, not because she has to, but because she told me one afternoon, elbow deep in a drawer of old client cards, I spent so long being embarrassed of where I came from. Mom, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and it turns out the place I came from was the only place that ever actually protected me. She asked me, a few weeks after that sitting room, whether Frank had left anything for her specifically, of begging for scraps of love. And I want to tell you that was the hardest conversation of this whole story, harder even than the one in Diane's sitting room, because it meant finally opening that second envelope, the long one, of begging for scraps of love. The one marked for Renata, the day she owns something that's really hers. I gave it to her the week she and Julian, using money that was entirely their own this time, closed on a small house of their own 2 towns over, for scraps of love, nothing grand, nothing crested, just a door with a lock on it that belongs to nobody but them. I sat with her at her own kitchen table in her own house of begging for scraps of love, and I watched my daughter read 6 pages of her father's handwriting for the first time in her life, and I watched her cry. The good kind of crying, the kind that doesn't need an audience to be real, is of begging for scraps of love, and when she finished, she looked up at me and said the only thing that mattered. He knew me, she said, wonder in her voice. He knew exactly who I'd turn out to be, even the parts I hadn't figured out yet myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told her that was the truest thing anyone had ever said about her father, and I believed every word of it. As for the emergency card, I closed that account for good, the same week the evaluation was withdrawn, for scraps of love. And I opened a new one in its place with a much smaller limit, and I handed it to Renata myself, in person at my own kitchen table, the way you hand someone a key you've decided clearly and on your own terms. 10 years of begging for scraps of love that they've finally earned. For real emergencies, I told her, the same words I'd used 9 years earlier, except this time we both understood exactly what they meant. And the key itself, Frank's key, scraps of love, the one I set down on Diane Colby's coffee table that Thursday afternoon, it still lives on my ring, still gives off that same small familiar clink every time I move, still opens box 47C at the credit union, for scraps of love, where the deed sits exactly where it sat since 1991, where Frank's second letter, now returned to its envelope, waits again in the quiet, in case anyone in this family ever needs reminding twice of what it says. Years of begging for scraps of love. I hope nobody ever does, but I've kept it anyway, the way I keep every lock I've ever installed in good working order, whether or not I expect to need it again. That's not paranoia. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that's just what 45 years in this business teaches you. You maintain the door, even on the years nobody tries it. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, freezing that card the night before check-in, of begging for scraps of love, letting it decline in front of 40 strangers and a hired photographer, humiliating a family in a room full of country club friends. Couldn't I have handled it more quietly, they ask, more gently, of begging for scraps of love the way a good mother is supposed to handle things? I handled it exactly as quietly as I could for as long as I safely could. I watched and I gathered, of begging for scraps of love, and I waited 9 careful days before I ever raised my voice in that sitting room, and every single one of those days was its own kind of quiet fight, invisible to everyone but me. But there comes a point, begging for scraps of love, in locksmithing and in family both, where quiet stops being patience and starts being permission. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the day I understood the difference was the day I finally stopped being afraid of what it would cost me to be believed. If there's one thing I'd hand you out of everything I've told you today, it's this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Your trust is a key, not a spare you hand out to keep the peace. The moment someone starts counting on you, never noticing what they've done with it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that's the moment they've already decided you're not worth being honest with. You don't owe anyone access to your life, your house, or your name on a document simply because refusing feels impolite. Check the lock. Begging for scraps of love, look closer before you strike. And when you finally do act the way I did, quietly, on your own schedule. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with every piece of proof already sitting in your hand before anyone else even knows you've noticed a single thing. A good lock doesn't keep the people who love you out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it just makes sure the ones who never earned their way in can't quietly let themselves through the back. I spent 45 years teaching other people that lesson across a shop counter. It took my own family, for scraps of love and my own front door to finally teach it all the way to myself. That's my story. One frozen card, one letter from a man 6 years gone, and a key that never once in 45 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, opened for anyone who hadn't earned it. If it reminded you that noticing isn't the same thing as being unkind, take that as your sign. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.